Imagine the surprise that Kathy Guest, a British mother of two, must have felt when she was doing something as mundane and routine as spring cleaning. She was cleaning out the attic earlier this year. She discovered a bass guitar that had belonged to her deceased husband. He had inherited it from his brother. She hadn't seen it. She starts looking at it and doesn't know much about guitars and thought, I should maybe Google this. Maybe this is worth something. Who knows? So she looks at the make and model number. It was a bass guitar, a 1963 Hofner 50/1 bass guitar. The same one that in 1972 was stolen from the back of a van in Notting Hill, London. Turns out, Kathy was in possession of Sir Paul McCartney's famous guitar that he used to record hits like Love Me Do and She Loves You. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what would you do if you were reunited with something so valuable after all those years, something that felt like it was literally part of your body, part of you, part of who you were? Well, McCartney was so pleased to receive the guitar back after 52 years that a guitar that he originally paid £30 for, he now rewarded Kathy with $10 million. Probably a bit better than she could have done at the pawn shop. Last year, John Fogerty settled a 50-year copyright struggle for the Creedence Clearwater Revival music catalog. In an age when musicians like Bob Dylan, Neil Young, and yes, even Bruce Springsteen are selling their catalogs for hundreds of millions of dollars, Fogerty now bought back and owns the songs he wrote 50 years ago for the first time ever. What would you do if you were reunited to something so valuable and so precious after all those years, something that indeed imprinted something of who you were into it? Well, Fogerty took to the road in a worldwide celebration tour, a secular liturgy procession around the world, if you will. And that's the scene our reading has for us in 2 Samuel this morning, a liturgical procession, and the recovery of something that stood at the center of Israel's identity as a people, and as the people specifically that were brought by God up out of the land of Egypt into the land that they now possessed, a land flowing with milk and honey. The Ark of the Covenant had been in storage for 20 years, up in Abinadab's attic. Before the boy David was ever anointed by Samuel, before Samuel had anointed even Saul as king, before Israel had a king, Israel received the Ark of the Covenant back from the Philistines, who, after having stolen it and were terrorized and haunted by the presence of God in their midst through the Ark of the Covenant, they said, "Here, please, come get it. We don't want it anymore." So Israel receives the Ark back with much commotion in a scene that seems like it's pulled right out of an Indiana Jones film. 70 of the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh are put to death simply for looking at the Ark. Fearful of even being in its presence, the people store it away in Abinadab's house, and they put his son Eleazar in charge of guarding it. Not a bad contract job for 20 years, huh? But now there's a new king in town, and David makes it a priority of his administration to return the ark back to Jerusalem, where it belongs. Psalm 132 recounts how David swore to the Lord and vowed to the mighty one of Jacob, "I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob." So, David takes the ark and does the same thing that Israel did 20 years before when they moved the ark from the land of the Philistines to Abinadab's house, he places it on a cart. Not just any cart, he places it on a new cart. One like that donkey on which Jesus rode into Jerusalem, one that had never been used for any other purpose. Except along the way, the oxen stumble. What would you do if you were reunited with something that had such value? Something that you had been parted from for all these years, something that not only shaped the identity of your people, but contained the very presence of God himself. And what would you do if that very item, now recovered, was at risk of being destroyed? Well, one of the attendants, his name was Uzzah, he did what likely any of us would do. He stretched out his hands to hold the ark up and make sure it didn't fall. Now, this next part isn't in this morning's reading. Our lectionary skips this part of the story because as Uzzah stretches out his hands to steady the ark, God smote him. He smote him there because he put forth his hand to the ark, the text says. And Uzzah is consumed by the living God. We have a difficult time with the notion that God would strike down someone like Uzzah, someone who we think is doing the right thing, someone who looks like he's passionate about the things of God, he cares for the Ark of the Covenant, someone who innocently enough was only trying to help, and in a split-second decision was judged for a knee-jerk reaction that any of us would find ourselves doing too. There's a lot bound up in this episode, which is first and foremost a story. And like all storytellers do, your preacher included, there are rhetorical moves made and exaggerations offered to drive home a point, particularly when feelings like anger and wrath are described to a God who, throughout the scriptures, is revealed and described as loving. Christians believe that God is immutable, which means that unlike us who fall in and out of love or who love to varying degrees, God does not change. God does not change his love or the degree to which he loves. There is no shadow of turning with thee, the hymn writer declares, echoing the prophet Jeremiah in Lamentations. While the scriptures assign mutable actions to God, the changing of mind or the movement from love to anger, these are human ways of understanding the form that genuine love can sometimes take. Catholic Bishop Robert Barron puts it like this: if I love someone who is on a self-destructive path, my will of that person's good, and remember, that's how Aquinas defined love, to will the good of the other person. If I love someone who is on a self-destructive path, my willing of that person's good will doubtless appear harsh, angry, even punitive, for I am trying to get that person rightly aligned. We know what Bishop Barron is talking about. Catch only a glimpse of me at a particular moment with one of my kids who is out of alignment, as he says, or maybe even a parishioner. And depending on your knowledge of the situation, you may think me harsh, a bad parent, or even maybe a bad priest. This sentiment is also captured by the author to the Hebrews. Those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. Instead of literalizing the language of this story, Bishop Barron encourages us to read scriptural accounts like this as a poetic indication of the dark face of love that remains essentially mysterious to us. Uzzah's demise points ultimately to David's failure to properly secure the ark as God commanded in the law of Moses. David's use of a cart may have been faster, but God had prescribed a different way to transport the ark. and had given clear instructions not to put your hand forth to touch the Ark of the Covenant. Poles were to be inserted into the sides of the ark and carried on the shoulder of the attendants. Obedience is a big thing in 1st and 2nd Samuel. That's what Saul's downfall was all about. Instead of listening to the Lord and obeying the voice of the Lord, Saul thought he knew better. And even in such a way that seemed kind and gratuitous and loving, much like Uzzah here. But to obey is better than sacrifice, the Lord says. To hearken better than the fat of rams. God wishes to be worshipped aright, and the purpose of the liturgy is to restore humanity to its proper order. Restore humanity to the purposes for which God created us. We were all created with an owner's manual, a set of instructions, if you will. The problem is that we tend to use ourselves and the gifts that God has given us and the creation around us not in accord with the plans and purposes of God. And when we do that, we cause a great deal of devastation and harm both to us and to those around us. So we come here to a place like this and experience a liturgy like this week after week to align ourselves with the purposes for which we were created. That's what the liturgy does. Now, Uzzah was not the only one consumed by the living God in this story. As the ark is brought into Jerusalem, David dances before the Lord with all his might. David's wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, chastises him later on in the verses that follow this reading for his public display through the streets of Jerusalem. She accuses him quite bluntly in the Hebrew of exposing himself in an indecent way as he danced. Now, for Episcopalians who are used to being reverent and composed and reserved in our worship, this might actually be more alarming to us than the demise of Uzzah. Being undignified in one's worship, exposing oneself in worship. But the text is doing something important here. He dances before the Lord, exposed, and is not ashamed. Unlike the first humans in the garden who hid from the Lord because of their nakedness. The image of David dancing is the image of a fully alive human, one who is not afraid to be seen by the Lord, and one who is not afraid to be seen by others as well. The zeal that consumes him here. Curiously, David is wearing a linen ephod, a liturgical garment worn by priests. Be like if the text said he was wearing a chasuble, like Father Yoshi has on. David is wearing a linen ephod, a liturgical garment, and he offers to God along the way every 6 paces, we're told, which would mean there's a lot of sacrifice going on. He offers to God sacrifices of burnt offerings and sin offerings, what will later become temple sacrifices when his son Solomon erects the temple. David is acting here in this story as a priest over creation. The goal that God has for us to reflect back to God the praises of humanity and of all creation. That was the purpose in the Garden of Eden. And he does so as one who is in a right relationship with God and right relationship with those around him. Now, the zeal that consumes him here points us on to a future king in David's royal line. One whose zeal consumes him in such a way that he cleanses the temple in John chapter 2. Once again, we return to a frightening picture of God's consuming desire to be worshipped aright and the lengths to which God will go to ensure that happens. Because the habits of worship produce their intended outcomes. The habits of worship produce their intended outcomes. You are here, week in and week out, doing the same thing over and over, forming habits. Habits that shape you, habits that form you, habits that you can't go without if you stay away from here too long. because those habits make you people who are capable of confessing your sin and offering praise to God and declaring whose kingdom this rightly is all around us. The habits that are being formed in you here, though at times it seems boring, they're habits that are forming you to go out from this place and be equipped to be the sort of people that God has made you to be in baptism. And so the habits of worship produce their intended outcome. They make you a people who are both capable of confessing your sin and a people capable of forgiving others who have wronged you. They make you a people who are capable of holding loosely the things you have as you offer them back to God, the author and finisher and creator of all. In the end, we come here, week by week, to be consumed, but not destroyed, as we stretch forth our hands to lay hold of something far more costly than the Ark of the Covenant, to lay hold of the very flesh and blood of the Son of Man. And as we do so, we are purged. Sometimes, yes, by the dark face of God's love. And in that process, we, like David, are restored to the true glory of humanity, so that we can be equipped to serve as priests in this world, summing up the praises of creation and standing before the Lord without fear of being consumed. Amen.